Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our review Unit 8 on the post-Civil War West, looking at the review sheet from top to bottom. For whom was the West a land of opportunity? There was once a DBQ question from AP on to what extent were natural resources the reasons for the development of the West, and to what extent were other reasons. And this is basically, why did the West get developed? So some people involved in this development are farmers, are ranchers, are cowboys, miners, railway builders, especially Chinese railroad builders, Mormons, exodusters. And keep in mind, many of the cowboys are black, many of the cowboys are Mexican, about a third of them. For whom was the West not a land of opportunity? Indians, discrimination against the Mexicans, and discrimination against the Chinese. Indian Territory, once open, the white settlers became what state? And that is Oklahoma. And of course, the settlers that snuck in before the gun were called the Sooners. Why were the Black Hills in Dakota, which had been promised to the Indians, invaded by white settlers in 1874? Well, that's the discovery of gold. And the general who is sent to stop these trespassers is General Armstrong Custer, who we later see annihilated with his 200 plus odd soldiers at the Battle of Little Bighorn by the Indians under Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. The importance of the buffalo, or more popularly known, the bison, to the Plains Indians. Remember, the Indians used the buffalo for just about everything. They ate the meat. They used the hide for clothing. They made teepees. They took the bones, used them for tools, and the dried dung was used for a source of fuel. And the Plains Indians adapted the horse. Remember, horses did escape from eventually from the Spanish settlers farther south, and they multiplied on these, the grasslands. And the Indians used the horse for mobility, to hunt the buffalo down. One of these ways the Indians adapted to their environment. And why did the Plains Indians eventually have to move to reservations? Well, the short of it is military defeat. But part of that military defeat is the deliberate, but also the systematic killing of buffalo for commercial reasons. If you don't have a food supply, then you become essentially beholden to the government. You become wards of the state. The government did promise food, did promise farming supplies and things like that through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which basically was notorious for stealing from the Indians, stealing these goods, or providing shoddy goods to the Indians. The Dawes Severalty Act was an attempt, well, it did away with the reservation system, and the attempt here is to assimilate the Indians, to Americanize them. After all the other groups that have come to America don't, basically for the most part, don't live communally, don't live on reservations, and they are working as farmers, as individuals, as individual families. The idea is to do this for the Indians, to help them adapt. And when the tribal system, reservation system, was put back in place, a good chunk of this land was eventually lost to white people. What happened at Sand Creek, 1864, in the middle of the Civil War? The Cheyenne were massacred by Colonel John Chivington, one of the shameful episodes in Anglo-Indian relations. Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce. Chief Joseph is famous for leading the Nez Perce Indians on basically an escape from the U.S. military, marching across the Northwest, and eventually they're stopped just before they cross Canada. But it's one of these, army chasing Indians who are not going to stay put where they're supposed to. What was the ghost dance and its purpose? The ghost dance, the purpose here was, it's a religious ceremony, and it's was believed that if you did this dance, it would make the buffalo come back and the whites disappear. And at Wounded Knee in 1890, soldiers who are afraid of what's happening here, these sort of wild Indian braves, these young Indian men who are sort of dancing in ecstasy here, are thought to be sort of ginning up a revolt, and they are gunned down. And this is 1890. Wounded Knee is really symbolic of the end of the Indian Wars. And also in 1890, Frederick Jackson Turner writes that essay, The Significance of the Frontier in United States History, and he says the frontier, according to the census, according to population statistics per acre, has also disappeared. So 1890 is really symbolic of the end of really the freedom of the Indians. The Homestead Act, remember during the Civil War, the Homestead Act was passed to encourage settlement in the West, and it gave 160 acres to anyone who would live on those acres for 5 years, and about 400,000 head of household take up the offer for free land. The Morrill Land Grant Act, 1862, offered 30,000 acres of land to a state per member of the U.S. Congress. And the idea here is for to develop more efficient farming methods, but these become the basis of much of the public education system, public university system in the United States. And the Morrill Land Grant Act is eventually sort of retroacted to Eastern schools. So there's a lot of Eastern schools that are also given, or states that are given land for colleges or for universities. How are the railways tied to Western economic growth? The railways brought settlers and immigrants and farmers from the East to the West, and brought to the East goods that were collected out in the West, whether it's food, whether it's wheat and grain and longhorns, and later cattle that are being brought to the cities, but also resources, bringing coal and bringing iron, and during the Civil War, importantly, bringing gold and silver to help finance the war. These things, it's sort of a virtuous cycle of the goods maybe being processed into steel rail, so the rail and the bridges are going out to bring settlers to farther out west, and then more goods are being brought back to the east. Bonanza farms, these are massive corporate farms of over 10,000 acres, more like what we think of farms today. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862, you have the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific railroads are being subsidized, being paid per mile to build a track from Omaha out to Sacramento. And this railway famously has Chinese immigrants working on it through the Rocky Mountains, and it is completed at Promontory Point a couple years after the Civil War ends. This is the first of several of these railroads, and the railroads are very important for bringing settlement, for bringing political organization out into the West and these goods east. And the Long Drive is the name of moving longhorns and moving cattle later from southern Texas up to the railroad towns in northern Texas and places like Kansas and Oklahoma. Joseph Glidden is famous for inventing barbed wire. Shortage of wood out west, so barbed wire does the trick for limiting the movement of cattle so they're not, say, just escaping or going on to farmland. And again, cowboys, minority groups that made up a third of the cowboys, these would be African Americans, and also the vaqueros, the Spanish farmers. You should also know the nickname for black soldiers who don't quit after the Civil War but are positioned out west in these small forts garrisoning the West, and these would be, the Buffalo Soldiers are the nickname for African American soldiers. The importance of mining. Mining draws development. Gold and silver bring these huge rushes of people looking, panning, but later these the mining enterprises become corporate driven. And what this means is, rather than some guy with a pan on a creek with his pick and a burrow, you end up with these huge hydraulic pumps that just blast away the sides of hills and mountains, and you have these sluices and these sieves that are collecting gold on a more industrial scale. You see a fair amount of ecological and environmental degradation with the mining, much of it what we would call open pit today. And again, this wealth from the West helped funded the Northern War effort. There was inflation in the North, but the war is more funded in the North than the South. Remember, the Confederate dollar becomes worthless by war's end. But these Western mines pull settlers into the West and speed the political development, which means development of towns and cities, and this population leads to statehood. 5,000 people, you can set up your own territory, self-governing. 60,000 people, you can petition Congress to come in as a free and independent state. So some thoughts there on Western expansion and development and who's doing what after the Civil War. Signing off.